Check, 1, 2, check, check. Welcome to the 2022 Annual ACBAS Lecture. To those who are present here in the Sarah Daly Nickerson Chapel, at Acadia Divinity College, at Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, and to those of you who might be joining us online tonight in real time or later through our recording. In case you don't know what ACBAS is, it is the Acadia Center for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies, one of the centers of excellence here at Acadia University. I'm Carol Ann Jansen, and I presently serve as the chairperson of the Administrative Committee of ACBAS. It was founded 32 years ago by Dr. Rawlyk Lecture, and we're pleased to see his daughter, one of his daughters, here this evening. He was professor of church history here at ADC, and the center was a cooperative venture between Dr. Zeman and Ian Bates, the head librarian of the Vaughan Memorial Library at the time. And that houses the Baptist Collection, which is a rich archive of Atlantic Baptist documents and resources. I'd like to invite Dr. Anna Robbins, the president of Acadia Divinity College, we only wish, to extend a welcome on behalf of the college and to open our evening session with prayer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jansen. As she said, I'm Anna Robbins, president of Acadia Divinity College. That's enough. And delighted to be here tonight to offer my welcome to you as well, both those in the room here in the chapel, as well as those who are joining us in the live stream, and those who will watch it after tonight. We recognize that this is a lecture that lives on, and those who are watching tonight represent really only a portion of the audience who will partake of this lecture. We're grateful for these annual ACBAS lectures, as well as for our partnership with the university in the work of the Acadia Center for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies. And so with that in mind, it is my absolute delight to open this evening with prayer. Let us pray. God, we are grateful for the land on which our feet stand. We're grateful for those who have taken care of it for so long. We're grateful for this place that has spoken for so long of the work of Baptists and Anabaptists in this place and elsewhere. We are grateful for opportunities to study and to learn and to reflect together. And so as we seek your blessing on this evening's events, we ask your blessing on our lecturer and lecture, on hearers and listeners. We pray that we might be those who listen, who reflect, and who grow in our learning. And to that end, we give you thanks. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I'd also be remiss if I didn't say a very quick welcome home, Gord.
You stole my thunder there, Anna, because I'm going to say that too. So, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the lecture series and about our guest lecture this evening. This year's lecture, which focuses on the Baptist side of our center's interests, is called the Rawlyk Lecture, and it's named in honor and memory of the late Dr. George Rawlyk, an eminent professor of history at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Dr. Rawlyk was a dean of Baptist history in Canada and was a close friend of Dr. Zeman's as well. He contributed significantly to our understanding of Canadian Baptist roots and life, being a prodigious researcher and author in this field, and supervising countless dissertations. I'm delighted to welcome and introduce you to our 2022 lecturer, Dr. Gordon Heath. He's the professor of church history as well as the centenary chair in world Christianity at McMaster Divinity College in Hamilton, Ontario. It's a special joy to me to welcome him because not only is he an alumnus of Acadia Divinity College, having received his MDiv honors degree from Acadia in 1994, but I got to know him personally during his ADC days when our degree programs overlapped. Dr. Heath earned his doctorate from the University of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto in 19... Oh, no, I've got the wrong date. 2004, right? 24. He is a busy teacher and diligent historian, authoring books on various facets of Canadian Baptist life and Canadian and Christian, specifically Christian experiences in the wars of the late 19th and 20th centuries, with particular attention to Canadian Christians and the First World War. Gord is also an ordained Baptist minister, having served as pastor here in Nova Scotia. His lecture this evening is entitled Canadian Baptists and the Fall and or Falling of the British Empire, 1945 to 1956. You'll have an opportunity to engage with Dr. Heath after his lecture through Q&A time. Now, if you're joining our live stream, I hope you are watching on the ADC website at acadiadiv.ca/Rawlyk, because that's where you may enter your questions. And of course, if you're here in the room, you may ask directly. A note about these questions. The recent death of our former monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, has renewed a discussion of the past history of the British Empire in the affairs of people groups and nations around the world, and the future role of the Commonwealth and the monarchy in Canada. Dr. Heath would like the questions to be specifically relevant to his lecture time and period for this evening. Welcome home, Gord. We're looking forward to what you have to share with us this evening.
Well, thank you very much. And it is indeed an honor and a privilege to be here. And it's great to return back to Nova Scotia and to the Divinity College. And a lot of history here in this province. And actually, my history with the college goes back to the 70s. I have a picture at home in the chapel, my mother, my father, my two brothers, my sister, myself, front row in chapel, Dr. Zeman beside us. And it's a black and white picture. And so I must have been 12 or 13 at the time, but it's a pretty neat picture of my chapel attendance. So I have proof that I actually did attend chapel when I was only 12, but there you go. Thank you to Acadia Divinity College for the invitation. As I said, it's a privilege and an honor to be here, and thank you to the Acadia Center for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies, and in particular, thank you to Drs. Robbins and Jensen and Maxwell. My subject is Canadian Baptists in the fall or the falling of the British Empire. You've probably wondered what's going on with the word falling there. Is that a typo? That's intentional. That's what we do when we're undecided. It's a fall, but it's also a process of falling. And so to recognize that, there's much going on and it's hard to come down on whether it's over or it's falling. I just recognize, those dynamics in that fall or falling of the British Empire. And I think you'll get a sense of that as I go on through the subject. Thank you for those comments on questioning. I'll take questions related to contemporary events, as long as you realize that I didn't prepare for them. My preparation is here, but as I prepared and for the invitation, of course, we didn't know that the Queen was going to pass away, and so I don't have anything specific on her passing or what's going to happen to the Commonwealth in the coming years and decades. So let's get started, and I'm advancing these now, right? Yep, okay. So I'm pressing, but it was working earlier. Well, I'll get started, and then you can pass me that when it's ready, if it gets ready. So Canada celebrated its Dominion status in 1867 and was a young, optimistic nation. And even though it was this young, optimistic nation, it still remained part of the British Empire. Pierre Berton's observation that, quote, "The youth of Canada breathed in the spirit of imperialism with their breakfast porridge," aptly describes the extent of imperial sentiment in Canada, especially English Canada, at the end of the century. Like other denominational papers, the Canadian Baptist, Maritime Baptist, and the Western Baptist proudly trumpeted Canada's place in the empire. Next slide. Reflecting the zeal for imperial expansion was commentary during a victory in the South African War, and this just gives a sense of some of the commentary. During the celebrations in Toronto, after the British capture of Mafeking, which was a huge battlefield success at the time, it was stated that if there was a Boer sympathizer in the land, that was a day for him to keep indoors and be quiet as a spy in the enemy's camp or a traitor at home. So you're getting a sense of, there's some pretty ardent, imperialism going on, and that came from Ontario. Yet half a century later, the discourse on empire had shifted significantly. In his Founders' Day address at Acadia University, next slide, please. In 1951, George Nowlin stated, "In 1926, Canada and the other dominions were recognized as equal partners in the British Commonwealth. From that day on, our independence has been as real and as complete as that of any other nation in the world. Whatever may be said about the imperialism of Great Britain, the fact remains that we have escaped it." And so very different commentary on empire and Canada's place within the empire. So what happened? What happened between the Boer War and then the period 1951? Of course, the Korean Wars were raging at that time. So what happened over the course of those 50 years? In his presidential address, next slide, please. In his presidential address to the Canadian Historical Association in 1993, Philip Buckner asked the question, whatever happened to the British Empire? His concern was the way in which Canadian historians had become fixated on the evolution of a national identity that made little or no room for a Canadian imperial connection. While Buckner's work is a necessary corrective to notions of Canadian nationalism that disregard or are embarrassed by Canada's imperial past, his work virtually ignores Canada's churches. Buckner's not alone in this regard, however, for others, such as Neville Thompson, make basically no mention of churches in their discussion of post-war drift from empire. The record of historians of Christianity has improved over the years since Buckner posed his question. A number of master's theses, as well as recent doctoral dissertations, such as by Melissa Davidson and Adam Rudy, have begun to explore this important intersection of religion and imperial identity in Canada. Let's see if we got this going now. There we go. As I've noted in a couple books, A War with a Silver Lining and The British Nation is Our Nation, at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, Baptist churches, along with other Protestant churches, Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptist churches understood their role to be that of nation builders, and their nationalism was decidedly imperial. And for a number of years, I've been spending time examining just what happened to that imperial sentiment that was so connected to their nationalism. Basically to answer Buckner's question, whatever happened to the British Empire? This presentation focuses solely on Canadian Baptists, the British origin Baptists in Western, Central, and Eastern Canada, and now we call them Canadian Baptists of Western Canada, Canadian Baptists of Ontario, Quebec, Canadian Baptists of Atlantic Canada, those churches today that belong to Canadian Baptist ministries, before that the Federation. And those are the Baptists I'm focusing on, not German Baptists or Swiss Baptists or French Baptists, but those Baptists that would very much identify with the British origins of the Baptist movement. And this work that I'm talking about tonight is part of a larger work that traces 70, almost 80 years of the discourse of the churches on empire from the 1880s into the 1950s. and I look at Anglicans, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and the United Church. And so I'm focusing on the end of the project. The project is basically written now. Now I'm just kind of cleaning it up, but I'm just focusing on the Baptists. But much of what we'll talk about is shared among Anglicans and Presbyterians and United Church. My sources are primarily the weekly periodicals that included detailed commentary on domestic and international news. And remember, when we talk about periodicals, these are basically newspapers. And Dr. Wilson, you know what I'm talking about here. And Pat, these are newspapers. You could, up until the 50s, if you read your Baptist paper, you would have a really good idea of what's going on in the world. After that, it becomes more what we think of now when we think of a denominational publication. And these papers, again, newspapers, are filled with domestic news, international news, editorials, sermons, poetry, prayers, images, Bible lessons, official denominational statements, minutes of assemblies. It's genres upon genres within the genre of a newspaper. It's fascinating. And historians have long recognized the value of such papers. And while one cannot assume that every Baptist held to the position or the positions of the paper or pulpit, sort of like today, they do nonetheless provide a sense of the public discourse common in the day. And you begin to get a sense of how discourse changes over the decades. And it helps us to understand trajectories and how editorials and how denominational officials and how denominational resolutions evolve over the course of years and decades. My concern is twofold. The first relates to chronology. When did the imperial vision start to fade? And when had it disappeared? And so that's the chronological part of things. The second is more analytical and is concerned with causation, the why. What were the factors that led to such a significant reorientation of national and imperial identity? So let me make a few comments about the when. The argument of this presentation is that the imperial and British identity, so critical to Baptist notions of Canadian national identity, remained into the post-Second World War years, but due to a number of both domestic and international developments, the British and imperial connection, once so integral to their national vision, could no longer be sustained and had become virtually abandoned by the Korean War. It also proposes that the churches played an instrumental role in aiding their congregations to adjust to post-war and Cold War realignments and realities. So that's the when. As for the why, there were a number of interrelated factors that contributed to the church's support for the drift from empire. Any attempt to explain the shift of imperial sentiment must consider the attitudes of the 1950s within the context of the trajectories established decades earlier. And so if you could see my larger product, you'd see that the change of discourse over the teens, the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. And much of what I will talk about tonight in terms of discourse, the seeds of it are planted before the First World War, during and after the First World War, and into the Second World War and after, but they really take root and begin to bloom and blossom because of what's happening internationally and domestically. And so there's this relationship between ideas and what's happening on the ground in terms of politics and history, those kinds of things. So 3 different groups of I've basically taken the factors that are taking place or that come to bear on Baptist views are clustered into 3 different categories or groups: international developments, domestic pressures, and nature of empire. So I'm just going to quickly state something, and then I'm going to run through all of these in detail for the time we have. First, international developments played a factor in shaping Baptist views of empire. Developments such as the formation of the League of Nations and then its second iteration, the United Nations, the weakening and breakup of the British Empire, the rise of the United States as a superpower, and the development of a bipolar world in the Cold War meant that a new way of envisioning global relations had to be embraced. The desire for a global reach or a sense of power that was previously actualized through the empire remained, but the means to achieve that sense of power was needed to be rethought. Let me comment on this notion of the sense of power. It's an expression, comes from Carl Berger's work on the book called The Sense of Power. And Berger's argument is Canadians, English Canadians in particular, are enamored with and supportive of the empire for a number of reasons in the late 19th century. But one reason is this sense of power. They want to have global impact. Canadians want to have some kind of positive, constructive influence on the world. How does that happen? Canada is just a single nation. You get a sense of power by drawing close to Britain and its empire, and then you have global reach. You draw close and you have this sense of power. You have this sense of being able to impact the world through the largest empire on the planet. It also provides protection. You can draw close to Britain and you're protected from America, and then you can also have this sense of power. And so this is very important. The sense of power came through empire, but as you'll see, I will argue that there's still a desire for a sense of power, but that will be transferred to something else because of events. So that sense of power that was previously actualized through empire remained, but the means to achieve it had evolved. The new organizations of global influence and security was the United Nations. And Canada could maintain a global profile and presence through participation in its activities. Britain's rapid and surprising decline also meant that Canadian security, once assured by the imperial connection, was increasingly found in relationship with the very United States that the relationship with Britain was supposed to protect us from. So it's all kinds of interesting reimagining of relations. Second, domestic developments related primarily to the changes in immigration patterns and the demographic composition of Canadian citizenry meant that the Anglo-Saxon identity, so central to the Church's vision for Canada, it had to be jettisoned. Significant and successful participation on the battlefields contributed to a growing sense of Canadian identity as well. And so there's this desire to move away from this colonial identity and colonial mindset. And so there are domestic developments that come to bear on the shaping of how Baptists imagine Canada. And third, as for the nature of empire, the seeds of the empire's own demise can be found within the idea of trusteeship. A critical element in the religious discourse related to conceptions of empire. The language of trusteeship is there in the political discourse, but it's certainly a part of the religious discourse. The language of trusteeship is basically at its core the conviction that God had raised up the empire and given it to Britain so that Britain could bless others. This is the language. With the manifold riches of civilization, good government, and Christianity, and in turn raise up people, to use their language, to eventually be able to look after themselves. And so this is a critical component to the DNA of imperialism in the discourse of the churches. In the 19th century, there had been undercurrents of unease with imperialism among nonconformists in Britain and among Baptists and others in Canada. But what made imperialism justifiable was the conviction that much good could result from the spread of empire. And so this notion of trusteeship is very important. Without it, one would question the degree of support for the empire. Now, I'm going to move into looking at this through a number of different conflicts, looking at it through, we're just going to look at post-war for a few minutes, then we're going to look at the Korean War, then we're going to look at the Suez Crisis. Why war, you say? Well, because it's in time of war that things really matter, and you will get discourse, you will get things said in times of war that really reveal what people think. Well, sometimes they go a little bit too far, perhaps they go further than what they really think, but you get a sense of passions, you get a sense of what's at stake in a time of war, and so it's a good time to look at these questions. So let's launch into things. The rise of the British Empire. We need this as a foil. I'm going to spend more time on its decline, but the impact of knowing about the decline is greater if you know what it was before, the ardent enthusiasm for empire before. And so let's look at briefly the rise of the British Empire. At the end of the 19th century, Canadian Protestant churches understood their role to be that of nation builders. However, for a long time, there had been little attempt to understand how that national sentiment was related to imperialism. And so historians have begun to work on that. Historians of Christianity in Canada have also tended to make the mistake of applying contemporary understandings of what it means to be a Canadian today to those of a century ago, basically taking 21st century Canada, superimposing it back in this period of time. And so when the churches talk about being nation builders, they think they're building a Canada of today. They're not. They're building a very decidedly imperial Canada connected to Britain and the Empire. As a result, the nation building the nation building theme, so, quote, central to the historical analysis of the Protestant experience in Canada between Confederation and the First World War, end of quote, quoting Phyllis Earhart there, is in need of some revision. For the church's nationalism needs to be placed within a larger imperial context. Now, this is no small matter. For much of the early decades of the 20th century, Baptists could not have conceived of a Canada or Canadian nationalism outside of the British Empire. Remember, unless I state otherwise, when I say Baptists, I'm talking about those Baptists of British origin. Okay? Support for the British Empire. Throughout the 19th century, Baptists had increasingly identified with the empire and its aims, and by the end of the 19th century, there was a potent mix of theological, racial, and imperial assumptions among Baptists within the empire. More specifically, assumptions regarding God's providence, Anglo-Saxon superiority, the benevolence of the empire, the advance of missions under the Union Jack. These all undergirded and colored every decision made regarding imperial conflicts. That was especially the case during the period known as the New Imperialism. And this is key. We need to understand this heightened imperialism at the end of the 19th century. New imperialism was marked by a dramatic intensification of imperial expansion and conflict between the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, and the start of the First World War, 1914. Of course, there was imperialism before. By new imperialism, they mean this scramble for Africa, this heightened imperialism where European nations are just racing with one another to basically take much of Africa into European empires. Baptist commentary reveals support for the surging imperial vision. As one commentator wrote regarding the conference, the Berlin Conference, the blessing of civilization long bestowed in rich abundance in Europe and North America, and in measure in Asia and South America, seemed now destined to overflow, flood with a new life, and light the long oppressed dark continent, with its swarthy races so long victimized by every nation possessed of ships and colonies. Never before in the annals of history of our race has such a hopeful prospect exalted for the inhabitants of an uncivilized region, brought for the first time into contact with strong and civilized peoples. Of course, that's not language we'd use today, but that's language that they used then. This gives you a sense of how they envision the opportunity, the golden opportunity, because tied with this expansion, of course, is the advance of missions. And if Baptists are excited about anything in the 19th century, especially the late 19th century, they're excited about global expansion of missions. And so there's this synergy between the scramble for Africa and the spread of missions. And so you see this kind of language throughout the late 19th century. And for many, the empire most able to bring about these blessings, these alleged manifold blessings, was the empire to which Baptists already belong, and that's the British Empire. Now, they do make it clear that it's a relative goodness. No Baptist says that we're talking about an absolute perfect empire. It's relative goodness, relative to other empires, relative to what's there, they're better off. And so it's not this Platonic, ideal and everything else is a shade, but the British Empire is the ideal, everything else is a shadow. No, it's a relative goodness, and that's how they would understand it. And we'll see some of that language later. While there was widespread support for the empire, there was no uniform idea as to what belonging to the empire meant. So you'll have different people coming down in different ways in which the Canada should relate to the empire, and what advances should be supported, critiqued. resistance against those kinds of things. And so there's a range of sentiments. That's part of what makes it very difficult when we talk about imperialism, because you have quite a range of opinion when it comes to of understanding who supports empire and for what reasons. And so we just need to note that. The significance of the shift away from empire can really only be understood when one understands this kind of language and this kind of support for the empire. The Canadian imperialism identified by Carl Berger in The Sense of Power was widely embraced by Baptists and promoted through their extensive denominational press. Read the missionary press, read the weekly periodicals. You can barely go a week in the late 19th, early 20th century without, it's just the air that they breathed. And if you look at conflicts, the Sudan expedition in 1885, Canada didn't send troops, we sent canoers, voyageurs. But if the war had lasted longer, we probably would have sent troops to the Sudan. The Real Northwest events of 1885, you can see it in the language there. Imperialism, you're going off to, partly to bolster and strengthen Canada, but also the empire out west. The Boxer Rebellion, you have a defense of Western imperialism during the unrest in China. In the South African War, the Boer War, our only choice lay between the surrender of South Africa, which would have involved the breakup of our colonial empire, the setting of the sun of British rule, and the setting back of the clock of the world's progress for perhaps a century, and the present war. That's how important going to war in South Africa was. You went to war for a number of reasons, and I've written a book on the reasons, but one of them is to come to the defense of empire. The First World War, Canadian soldiers went to war in the First World War to fight for empire, for many things, but one was empire, and you see it. It's just all the way through the language. Imperialism is the banner under which we must all henceforth march. We must all be imperialists from now on, avowedly so, or declare ourselves recreant to our highest trust and unworthy of our history's brightest page. To cry down imperialism now as though it were the consort of militarism would be incorrigible stupidity, if not unpardonable perverseness. During the last 15 months, the new imperialism has stood forth to strike down militarism once and for all and to champion the cause of international truth-keeping, brotherness, and peace. Now, they're making a distinction here between imperialism and militarism. If you were a Baptist in the late 19th, early 20th century, militarism was not imperialism. Militarism was a corruption of imperialism. That's how they would have understood it. And so that's when I talk about relative goodness. The relative good would be those who were faithful to the ideals of imperialism. Anything less than blessing people was a corruption. That's how they would have understood it. And finally, World War II. Once again, we affirm our loyalty to our empire, our leaders and our allies, our assurance of the righteousness of our nation's cause, and our confidence in the valor of those magnificent lads who on land and sea and in the air are steadfastly yielding to our empire's need the utmost in human service and devotion. Again, when you look at cenotaphs in across Canada and across Europe, those cenotaphs are filled with the names of soldiers who went, and if you had the opportunity to ask them, many would say they're going to fight for empire. They're going to fight for many things. Remember, you can fight for more than one thing. You can fight for your family, for empire, for your country, for your buddy next to you. So it's not like you have to pick something. You can fight for a number of reasons all at the same time. But empire is part of the discourse, part of the sermons, part of the liturgies of the chaplains. It's just there. It's ubiquitous. But what happens to that discourse? When did it drop off and why? And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my time on. When did it drop off and why? So here we are, the fall or the falling of the British Empire. Lots of books to read. Just like if you're looking at the fall of the Roman Empire, spend the rest of your life reading books on the fall of the Roman Empire. The fall of the British Empire. You're not going to spend the rest of your life, but you're going to spend a good chunk of years reading books on the fall of the British Empire. And so I just give you a sample of some titles that are that I think are good works, but there are many others. So let's spend time looking at this fall or the falling of the British Empire. The guns were barely silent after the Second World War, before nations realized that the war with Hitler and Nazism had helped usher in yet another conflict, one that threatened the very existence of the human race. Once allies united against Nazism, the Western powers and the Soviet Union increasingly looked across the Iron Curtain with suspicion, fear, and growing hostility. By the 1950s, the struggle between the capitalist West and communist East was being carried out by proxy wars in Asia and elsewhere. The real danger, of course, was a nuclear exchange between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And that, of course, would be catastrophic. Post-war developments. Commentary, this is right after the Second World War. Commentary on empire and monarchy reflected themes from past decades. So it's not like war ends, nobody talks about monarchy anymore. That's not the case. There's still sort of the traditional, language of monarchy and connections to England and so on and so forth. And so we just have to note that they're there. And so they don't end. The post-war world, however, experienced massive tectonic shifts in the geopolitical situation. The pre-war world had been marked by competing European and Asian empires, with Russia a regional power and America on the sidelines in its isolation. The empire had shown signs of decline for years and was able to stave off the rise of the US and the Soviet Union because they were bound up in their own affairs. They weren't really a challenge before the Second World War. But the Second World War, changed all that. The post-war years, post-World War II years, saw the decline of the French, Dutch, and British empires, the rise of the USSR as a superpower, and the introduction of the United States into the global competition of nations as the world's first nuclear superpower. In fact, it didn't take long for people to realize that the world had become marked by a binary conflict of East versus West. Communism versus capitalism, the USSR versus the US. As soon as the USSR became a nuclear power, of course, the world was divided into two camps with the power to destroy most of human life on the planet within hours. And it was a humbling time for those in the British Empire. For in very recent history, the empire had been the greatest empire on earth, able to exert its will almost with impunity. But as experience would quickly indicate, that independence and influence was in rapid decline. Post-war Britain experienced an economic crisis that not only cast a pall on the victory over fascism, but also weakened the nation and empire, as well as guaranteed austerity for British citizens into the 1950s. The debts of the war were crippling to Britain, and very quickly Britain, once the economic powerhouse of Europe, fell from the status of the world's preeminent power to a struggling middle power trying to adjust to a new world. Canadians had to face the fact that their security and global reach, that sense of power, had to be reimagined. They had to rethink, well, how do we think about our nation in the world? Stated differently, the changes in how the empire was envisioned was shaped in no small measure, one could even say primarily, by the shifting political developments at home and abroad. This is where events that you read in the headlines changes how you think about the nation and perhaps other aspects of how you see society being structured. As commentary reveals, that sense of power that was understood previously would be replaced by moving closer to the US, joining NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and especially by taking an active role in the United Nations. In a way, membership in the United Nations replaced all that Canada had gained through the empire. Canada got its reach, it got its global reach through the empire. Things had changed. It was not that the imperial dream died immediately. It didn't. However, it was obvious that the empire was a mere shadow of its past glory and that Canada's relationship with the empire had to be reconceptualized in light of a changing world. Here's a quote from the Canadian Baptist. This gives you a sense. I'm just giving you some of the commentary. Then we're going to switch to the Korean War. Of course, the United Nations Charter is only a beginning. in the supreme task of creating a new world civilization based on law and free cooperation. But the great hopeful fact remains that a beginning has been made, and that the new organization of United Nations has already begun to function with reassuring evidence of efficiency and success. We hail the United Nations as the first star of hope to appear in the black sky of a prostrate and ruined world. And then there's lots of other commentary on the very positive hopes and dreams associated with the United Nations. But let's look at the conflict of the Korean War and get a sense of how discourse is changing. The Korean War was the first overseas war that Canada fought that was not waged for the empire. It's the first. Yes, we fought with the Commonwealth, but the war was not waged by the empire or by the Commonwealth. It was a war fought under the auspices of the United Nations, and the Commonwealth and Canada participated in that United Nations effort. In January of 1951, Canadian or CBC radio listeners, this is back when CBC broadcast sermons, in 51, listeners heard Reverend Arthur Pike of Highfield United Baptist Church, Moncton, deliver a message entitled, "Will Russia Conquer the World?" The immediate crisis facing Canadians was the war in Korea, but Pike considered the wider threat of global communism to be palpable. He said, "It is this God-hating, Christ-crucifying, Bible-banning, bloody Russian communism that is causing all the turmoil, unrest, and strife across our planet today, and is leading our world to the brink of a third devastating war." Now, the comfort that Pike offered to his hearers was eschatological. The return of Christ, of course, would ensure that godless communism would not win the day, that ultimately Christians would triumph. Now, Pike was not alone in his angst over the Cold War menace of communism, and the fears of the period of time during the Korean War were exacerbated by the catastrophe of the Korean War. Before the ceasefire in July of 1953, there were over 750,000 dead and wounded among UN troops, 1.5 million North Korean and Chinese combatants dead and wounded, and over 2.5 million citizen casualties. It was a war of firsts for Canada. First military action under the UN. First war fought under US command. And if you know anything about Canadian history, we fought under British command or under our own in the Second World War, our own First Army, but never under Americans, and now we're under Americans. So under UN, under the US command, first war that generated relatively little interest at home, and the first war fought where victory was not the goal. You have to read up on the Korean War to understand that. Over 25,000 Canadian troops served in Korea with 516 fatalities, with just over 1,000 wounded. And the war carried on for over 2 years, much of it resembling trench warfare of the First World War. And peace talks just kept dragging on. Somebody counted the words that were spoken in the attempts to come up with peace. There were 575 separate meetings between North and South. 18 million words were exchanged in those. Wouldn't want the job to count those words. But anyway, there. 18 million words before they could hammer out not a peace, but a ceasefire. And now, of course, we still live with the results of that today. The last Canadian soldier left Korea in 1957. Now, this discourse supportive of Canada's previous wars revolved around concerns for the promotion of civilization, justice, and religious freedom. The discourse during the Korean War was much the same in this regard. However, a key difference was that the means to the end were no longer achieved primarily through empire. So that concern for, again, justice, religious freedom, civilization, now the discourse has changed. It's not through the empire that these things are achieved. Now it's achieved through the UN and through the US assistance. The post-war realities, such as the decline of the British Empire, the rise of Russia and the Cold War threat, meant that now Canada need to re-envision. And Baptists are imagining how Canada is as a nation in relationship to the empire. And those lofty goals of civilization and liberty and peace and freedom and those kinds of things are now sort of transferred to to the UN, and the UN is going to accomplish these things, and that becomes increasingly the discourse of the churches. A mere half-century earlier, Canada had belonged to the world's mightiest empire, a colossus that spanned the globe and demanded the respect of its competitors. Now, Russia had long been an imperial competitor, perceived to be threatening British rule in India and the Mediterranean. But after the Second World War, a great reversal occurred. Britain was no longer the colossus that could dictate terms to other foreign powers, especially ones such as Russia. As one preacher declared and decried, same preacher, Pike, Reverend Pike, today, Soviet Russia is the most potent power of the hour, geographically, numerically, military, and in natural resources. Great reversal. The world's been turned upside down for those who had lived with Britain at its height. It was a sobering admission for those with a memory of Britain's former glory, and many alive would have remembered when Britain was at its height. The mantle of imperial power had passed on to post-war Russia, and it was believed that on its own, Britain could not vie with Russia. Now, in the commentary of the press, I'm not going to read it here just to save a little bit of time. The commentary of the press continually dealt with issues of the day. The independence of India in 1957, a colony long considered the jewel of the empire, was just beginning its move into independence. There's commentary on British troubles, imperial troubles, Commonwealth troubles in India, Africa, Middle East, commentary on nationalist movements in Africa and in Asia, and spread of communism in Africa and Asia, and so on and so on. Crisis in Egypt, the nationalization of the Suez Canal, all kinds of commentary. And so I'm not going to go into those details. But through it all is this, if you pay attention to the language is shifting because the solution to those problems is primarily through the UN, not so much the empire cracking down, the empire pushing back and restoring this lost glory, but actually letting nations move in certain trajectories and telos. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't those who would argue for, crackdown on here and there and the other ones, but you begin to see a shift. My concern here, I often say to my students, is look for trajectories. What's taking place that moves the church this way or that way or this way? Because there are moment in time events that do establish trajectories or reinforce trajectories or nudge trajectories in different directions. The trajectories here are all being reinforced in rethinking how Baptists think about the empire and what is the role of not just Baptists, but Canada, churches, missionaries in its relationship with the empire. And increasingly, the discourse changes. Of course, British power didn't decline overnight. Thus my fall or falling, right? It's not that all of a sudden empire's over. That's not the case. But Baptist commentators were perceptive and could sense that it was certainly on a downward telos. What is noteworthy in the Maritime Baptist and the Canadian Baptist wartime commentary was an intentional reimagining of national and imperial identity. And a number of factors contributed to the erosion of once dearly held convictions. But it's a lot of them are the larger international, but also the domestic issues as well. Basically pushing Baptists to embrace new notions of Canadian national and imperial identity. Now, what was going on in the pews? It's very hard to know. We have newspapers, we have sermons, so I quoted you a sermon. But just because someone preached that doesn't mean everybody in the pews agrees, right? If you've ever preached, you know that that's the case. If you ever sat in a sermon, you know, I don't agree with that. But it's being preached. So you can't just make a direct correlation in the paper, in a sermon, therefore everyone believed that. And so getting to the views of people in the pews is difficult. But one way we can begin to get a sense over time is how things change. And the more time you look at, the better sense you get a change of how discourse is changing. You do get glimpses. You get letters to the editor, you get sermons, you get poetry, you get official statements from denominations. They don't tell us everything, but they tell us something. And the something that they tell us is that things are moving. Things are shifting imperial discourse is evolving. Central to the Baptist vision for Canada were interrelated notions of security, justice, and identity. And let me make a comment on how these were changing, and then I'll talk about the Suez Crisis and wrap things up. In regards to security, I've already mentioned this, so I won't spend time on it. Canada's place in the empire had provided safety from threats and the opportunity to project power abroad, but that's changing. Now we do that. Our security and our projection of powers now through UN, US, NATO, no longer Britain. That takes time, and people will push back on that, but it does require recalibrating. Justice. As for justice, the rise of communism and the decline of the empire was considered to be a grave threat to justice and liberty. But again, increasingly, the advance of civilization, good government, liberty and justice, that was to be through advances through United Nations efforts, not through enforced conquest of foreign peoples. And so there's a significant shift in a sense of how justice will come about, and identity. And so it doesn't end overnight. And so I include this picture here of Queen Elizabeth, because you will have, this is in 1953, so you will have commentary that's positive. So don't hear me saying, oh, in the 50s, everybody just dropped the monarchy. And you think, no, oh, nobody cared about the British Empire in the 50s. It's not what I'm saying. It's that there are shifts that are taking place in how people think about Canada's role within the empire and its relationship to the UN and United States and NATO and how justice can be accomplished in the world, and how human rights and those kinds of things can be reimagined. And the language of race, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, also begins to change, because Canadian national identity in much of Baptist discourse was about an Anglo-Saxon identity, and that will even shift. And so that's a dramatic change as well, because now, well, I'll get to that. I'm getting ahead of myself. So here we have Canadian Baptist, long may she reign. I added this slide just because of what happened in the last week or so with the passing of our Queen. And the slide on the right is in the Maritime Baptist in May 1953. It's a liturgy provided by the denomination for churches during the coronation. And so I expect there'll be one for Charles III next year in the Maritime Baptist, if they had a Maritime Baptist. But somebody will come up with one and distribute it to all the churches in the Maritimes. Anna, there's a job for you. Okay, all right. So, but it shows you, my point in putting that here is that it's not, don't hear me saying, oh, nobody cared about the empire or Britain anymore. That's not what I'm saying. I'm identifying when language began to shift and important ideas and concepts are becoming normalized in the discourse of Baptists and how they're talking about relationships with Britain. And one important shift is a language away from empire even to commonwealth. Now that the word commonwealth is used back in 1917, I think, by a South African general. But increasingly the language of empire is jettisoned, and commonwealth is brought into the discussion. Let's keep going. Here we go. And here's this quote that I already put up. Canada's move to being an equal partner in the empire was praised at the Founders' Day address at Acadia by George Nowlan, a member of Parliament. And I've already read the quote. I won't read it again. While other commentary on unrest in the Commonwealth provides examples of a constructed view of the other that undergirded British imperialism and justified an ongoing British presence in foreign lands, the same commentary was also marked by a note of uncertainty about the longevity of the imperial project. The notion that full dominion status was an option for non-white regions, as they were sometimes called, recognized that much of the empire would eventually, perhaps sooner rather than later, end up going the way of India. And so very quickly, not quickly, over the years, you have this idea that, oh, what's taking place is a move, a telos, a trajectory to other parts of the empire gaining what Canada and Australia and New Zealand have, and that's full dominion status, because now India has it in 47 and other parts of the empire are agitating for it. Now, there was a Commonwealth and Empire Baptist Congress that met in London in 1951. Commonwealth and Empire Baptist Congress, even the title is striking. They met in London in 51, and the language of trusteeship was invoked as a way of envisioning a future role for the empire. Speaking of nationalism, James Griffiths, Member of Parliament, said that their task in the spirit, and I'm quoting now, in the spirit of trusteeship and service, is to guide the colonial people into that fuller life for which they are reaching out, end of quote. And so here's this notion of trusteeship weaving its way into the discourse, saying that things are evolving, and that's okay because that's the way it was supposed to be. Maybe it's happening faster than you're comfortable with, but the DNA of imperialism in the British model was this notion of trusteeship, a move to increased independence, increased opportunities for those who are part of the empire. Embedded within the idea of trusteeship was the notion that Commonwealth relations were fluid and progressive, not static, fluid and progressive, with a vision for a multi-ethnic family of nations that begins to be part of the empire and part of the Commonwealth, that, oh, it's multi-ethnic. And that's a move away from this Anglo-Saxon notion of empire that now, oh, different parts, different ethnicities. What that meant for Canadians was the freedom to embrace new ways of constructing national identity, as well as the independence to come up with innovative ways of forging new international coalitions. And so all of a sudden you're able to think differently about empire. And lastly, the Suez Crisis. I want to make a few comments about the Suez Crisis and then wrap things up and then take some questions. Trends and trajectories of the Korean War, basically everything that I just said, continued apace into the next crisis in Egypt. And the crisis in Egypt in 56 was precipitated by a number of factors, but a central concern was the overthrow of the Egyptian president Nasser, who wanted to nationalize the Suez Canal, basically take it over and run it, which was a threat to Britain because, of course, and France and other nations, because that meant that Europeans couldn't control the Suez Canal, but Egyptians would, even though it's in Egyptian territory. The Suez Crisis was, in the words of one historian, the watershed for British influence, not only in the Middle East, but throughout the world. Once Britain and its empire had been able to act basically unilaterally, with relative impunity to assert its will, in foreign lands, but that simply was no longer the case. The conflict made it clear that Britain had dropped to a second-rate power, beholden to the US and the US's foreign policy. The role of the UN was also critical. No longer was the empire the organization for policing the world. Britain used to police the world, but no longer. That role had been taken over by the UN, and to act without UN sanction was increasingly deemed to be something that was illegitimate and illegal. It was clear that Britain and its empire was weakening, and its imperial reach and freedom of movement was dwindling. Church commentary on the crisis reveals that the trajectory seen in the Korean War had carried on. Events related to the rise and threat of communism continued to receive attention, as did the evolution of missions in an increasingly post-colonial world. A great source in getting at this evolving view of missions is to read the missionary literature, because missionaries in the field are having to adjust to the post-colonial world, and they're very quick to identify the sins of empire and the needs to adjust in the post-colonial world if missionaries are going to survive and thrive in former colonial or current colonial lands, parts of the British Commonwealth. And so you can read that commentary, very important to get a sense of how Western missionaries within those lands are viewing how the British Empire is to operate or should operate. The once familiar discourse of empire had evolved into something entirely different from a generation ago. It was clear that the empire was no longer a titan straddling the globe. Powers were waning, colonies were leaving, and the myth of Anglo-Saxon supremacy was dying. As the president of the Baptist Union of Western Canada stated, the British Empire is breaking up and being replaced by a reduced Commonwealth of Nations. Colonialism is disappearing, and a fierce nationalism is taking its place. The myth of white supremacy has been exposed and discredited. The world's center of gravity is moving from London, Paris, and Washington to the East. And there's significant commentary on those very themes. What is noteworthy is that there was basically no remorse expressed for the decline of the empire. In fact, there was a note of lamentation for the conduct of Britain, conduct that had undermined the notion of benevolent trusteeship. Remember, if the empire is supposed to be benevolent, any behavior otherwise is an undermining of the ideals of empire. But you'll have identification of that. The attitude of Asiatics and Africans today to the West is radically different. The West has been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Today, all over the Asiatic and African world, there is strong anti-West feeling. This strong antipathy has many causes. Part of it rises from the East's review of colonialism. In the past 25 years, they have awakened to the fact that although Western imperialism undoubtedly brought them many signal benefits, yet these colonial empires were not really philanthropic agencies. As for the Suez Crisis itself, the actions of Britain and France were deemed to be an unjustifiable war of aggression. Interesting, the churches will call this a war of aggression. Go back to the Sudan in 1885. Basically a blank check, for British imperial advance. They trusted British authorities to be doing the right thing. The South African War, the First World War, less so the Second War, but there was an implicit trust in Britain to act and to act quickly for the interests of empire. Now Britain acts arbitrarily, and the churches criticize it, saying that it's an unjust act of aggression. Why? Because Britain didn't go through the United Nations. Now the United Nations is supposed to be taking care of these things, not the global police of the British Empire. So a very significant shift. No longer the Britain and its empire have the right to act unilaterally in matters of foreign policy. The decline of the empire and the rise of the US made such actions virtually impossible. But so did the existence of the UN, as I've said. And again, international grievances needed to be dealt with through the United Nations. It was unconscionable for the British Empire to act independently. That is a dramatic shift in discourse among Baptists and their sense of empire. As for national identity, the monarchy was still appreciated. Canada remained envisioned in the Commonwealth. Nobody at this time, or not many, are saying, Canada should just jettison the Commonwealth, jettison the monarchy. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the discourse is shifting away from the discourse of the Boer War, the First World War, Second World War. And Canada was seen to be growing more self-confident and more independent as a nation. And as a number of further statements on race indicate, the churches in Canada condemned racial discrimination of any kind, a continuation of the trajectory away from notions of a distinctly Anglo-Saxon national identity. I'll say this here before I say it later, perhaps. The Holocaust during the Second World War was horrors unimaginable. One of the impacts of the Holocaust on views of empire post World War II, and actually even during, you can read it in some of the discourse during. In fact, the United Church in 1944 publishes a massive work on world, church, and nation. And it says that Anglo-Saxon superiority is the same racism as German Nazi anti-Semitism. And that's the United Church saying that in 1944. And you'll see the impact of the Holocaust basically rattling and shaking Baptists and other denominations to say the racism implicit within this Anglo-Saxon superiority is really no different. You're ranking people, you're racializing people in ways that are contrary to the gospel. And so that works its way through. And increasingly in the 50s, Baptists will begin to disentangle Anglo-Saxonism and Anglo-Saxon superiority with their vision of what Canada should be like and what a real Canadian should be, and all those problematic aspects of that kind of racism. In conclusion, so what happened to the British Empire among Baptists in Canada? By the 1950s, the empire had fallen or was falling, and this chart gives you an idea of why you can say it fell, and look at from 40s to 50s, there's this dramatic drop off. Or you could say it's falling because it continued into the 60s and 70s. But there you go, that's my title, and I'm sticking with it. The discourse among Baptists in support of Canada's previous wars often spoke of a defense of civilization, a war for justice, promotion of religious freedom, and citizenship, at least among the non-Francophones, was often framed as essentially tied to being Anglo-Saxon. And the discourse during the Korean War and the Suez Crisis reveals those changes that I've identified. The 1950s are important years for gaining a sense of how Baptists negotiated the rapid changes to generations of notions of national and imperial identity. And an examination of the Baptist press provides evidence of transitioning assumptions and a reimagining of Canadian national identity. There was still loyalty to British roots in the Empire, or Commonwealth as it was being recast, and a commitment to justice and liberty, but evolving geopolitical realities led to evolving wartime discourse and support for new coalitions. And as waves of immigrants came, historic horrors such as the Holocaust become more well known, the churches began to imagine a new vision for Canada in the world, one within the Commonwealth, but moving away from previous notions of Anglo-Saxon exclusivity. All of those trajectories would continue and accelerate into the 60s and beyond. And finally, what is noteworthy is that in the midst of tumultuous and terrifying times, much, not all, much of the discourse of the churches facilitated rather than bucked that reimagining of the nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for a stimulating and, to me, a new approach to thinking. So
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to open it up now for questions. And are there any in the room before I go to some of our line? Yes. No, just a minute. I'm going to see if I can get this to you so you can ask it yourself.
Were there regional variations in this trajectory? Were Canadians, Baptists in the West, differently inclined to the Maritimes, for example, or was it relatively uniform?
If you were to, my quick answer is basically it's the same across the board, West, Central, and East. You will find, and again, I'm talking about Baptists of British origin. And it's a pretty universal kind of commentary. I've not noted, you will find dissenting voices from one region or the other, but I'm not convinced that Western Baptists were less or more imperialistic than Maritime Baptists were less or more or central. Sometimes Ontario is pegged as sort of this very imperial, ardently supportive of empire region, and that's true. And when I went to this many, many years ago, I thought, actually back with you, Dr. Wilson, a long time ago, I thought I'd find very significant regional differences, but not enough to really say, the West is very different than the East, or the East is very different from Central. I think you can find examples of difference, but I don't think it's at least, I mean, I'm covering a lot of period here, a lot of decades, but I wouldn't be comfortable saying that, the West is really different on this than the center. You will have, earlier in the 19th century, the different notions of Canadian national identity in the Maritimes would be different from Upper Canada, right? But I'm not talking about that period. I'm talking, early, mid 20th century. So.
Thank you. Any other questions
No, thanks. I'm good.
from back here?
Thanks, Gord. Fascinating on all kinds of fronts. I have a bunch of questions, but I'm going to ask one for now. It's really interesting, this idea that globally we're looking to assert a Canadian identity. Canadians are looking to assert this identity. They find it in empire, they find it in UN. I think I can't help but think about how in poli-sci we learn how we, trade the symbols of empire for a blue beret, in the way we served overseas, for
Right.
example.
Yep.
And I wondered then, and you can tell me I'm completely wrong, but listening to this, I'm thinking, is it that desire and almost urgent need to construct a global identity that distracts Canadians from recognizing the way we were enacting empire at home?
Yep.
I'm always, I'm always trying to kind of find where is that? Where does that
Right.
sit in this picture? But thanks for the lectures. It's great.
My initial response is to say that in the late 19th century, home missions and foreign missions, or the work of the spread of Canada going to the west into the prairies, was very much seen as expanding the empire. And so it's hard in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to say, oh, empire out there, but not empire in Canada, because you are basically advancing in the mind of many, sort of British control within what today we call Canada, which wasn't the Canada that we understand at the time. So in a sense, it would depend on the time. Obviously, in the 19th century, that is British expansion and Canadian expansion in the Canadian West. During the time when sort of the Canadian boundaries are now sort of set as we basically understand today, Newfoundland's not in, but still. That's an interesting point. Does it? I'd have to think more about that actually, because part of, remember that stamp that I put up? Canada was central. It's there for a reason. That's a Canadian stamp. It's there for a reason. They would argue that Canada, the strength of Canada is critical for the empire, and so even a strengthening of Canada is related to the empire. Even domestic policies are related to building a strong Canada. Why? Because it's felt that Britain is waning. It's old, it's degenerate, industrialization, urbanization is corrupting it. We're young and virile and so on and so forth. We're a new nation. Our climate will keep us, the cold weather will keep us vigorous, But I like to think it's just keeps us cold, but it keeps us vigorous. And so there's a sense of a strong Canada will actually lead to a strong empire. And so it's really hard to pull apart domestic politics from our view of empire. And that's this notion of nation building, because you're not just building a Canada, you're building a Canada within the empire. And the empire will only benefit if Canada is strong as a nation, or Canada will benefit if the empire is strong. And so, I'm not sure I'm totally satisfied with my answer, but that's sort of where my answer is at the moment. When I'm on the plane back, I'll come up with a much better answer, but you won't be there. So, but
I'm going to give the online people a chance, and this question from David Bell really intrigues me too. So, one of the key Canadian political figures during this time was John Dieffenbaker, our prime minister at the time, who was half of British descent, and of course we know he was a Baptist as well. So how does his pre-1956 career fit into this story?
great question. I don't know about his. What I can say about Dieffenbaker, I'm not sure where to look. I'll look at the camera, I guess. What I can say about Dieffenbaker, he's an example. His fight for British identity, even though he's not 100% British background, German, if I remember correctly. So here you have an example. This is part of the strength. I'll get to your question. I'm not sure who you'd even point to, but to get to your question, this gives you an example of how strong the ideals of imperialism is. If you disengage it from Anglo-Saxonism, there are still ideals of imperialism. And so you'll have Canada's Indigenous people who will fight and die for empire in the First World War. You will have Second construction battalion. You'll have Black Canadians fight and die for empire. Why? Because of its Anglo-Saxon racism? No, but because of the ideals of empire and the ideals of British of governance that they would say you're not living up to, but we'll fight for the empire because hopefully you get around to living up to your ideals. And so Dieffenbaker is a good example of how, even though you're not, totally Anglo-Saxon, you still are in some way loyal to the British ideals and history of Canada. And so his resistance, I was just reading today, catching up on my Dieffenbaker. I'm glad I did, because you asked a question about Dieffenbaker. His resistance to the new flag, the development, Pearson developing the new flag in the 60s. He's famous for resisting. We had the Union Jack, then the Red Ensign, and then that was jettisoned for the flag that we have now. And for 6 months, vicious debate in Parliament over this shift. It's a statement. It doesn't mean that, now nobody cares about Britain and Empire, but it's again one of those signals that something's happening. There's a trajectory here, there's a telos, and we're shifting. And so Dieffenbaker is an example of that resistance to change. In terms of, let's keep British ideals. Let's not go too far and jettison them. I think he's a fascinating figure in that way. As an aside, when Dieffenbaker died, you drape the Canadian flag on the casket. Well, he had the Canadian flag and the Red Ensign sewn together and had both flags draped on his casket. And we have that in our archives at McMaster. We have that flag in a box folded up. So it's very fascinating. But I'm not sure I'm really getting to your answer. I couldn't tell you details of pre-50s of Dieffenbaker. I'm not an expert on Dieffenbaker, but I find him an interesting example because he does capture that sense of still embracing the ideals of Britishness, even though you have other, you've got German background or something like that. And of course, many Germans fought and died for Canada, and other ethnic groups. Many Japanese did, and others did as well. Because there's something about it that they recognize as this is, what I'm fighting and dying for. So.
Okay, any other questions from here? Anna is dying. Oh, no, Dr. Wilson first.
Gordon, a couple of things. I do remember Art Pike
Oh.
and his influence in the area.
Okay.
That follows up on a question. When we talk about changing allegiances, a lot of people are beginning to read American things. The Youth for Christ movement is very strong during Art Pike's era. And so in that whole context, they're moving their sources of what they're reading and identifying much more with American fundamentalism on some context. And I'm wondering whether that is part of that whole trajectory that happens at that point, because they would know John R. Rice much better than they'd know some of the famous evangelists in Britain. So
No, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of those movements are coming together where some people are critical of the drift to the United States. People are aghast that we're cozying up to the States in terms of foreign policy, but also culturally as well. And so, no, I think you're right. I haven't. It'd be interesting to go through the Maritime Baptist and Canadian Baptist, and just look at the sources. In the late 19th century, I did that for my doctoral dissertation. I sourced because of course they're reprinting. They're just reprinting and reprinting from all over. They read a good article and they put it in, and here's one from the British World or the Baptist Times in Britain. And so it's just, they're not plagiarizing because they source it, but they're just reprinting. But you can trace late 19th century Canadian publications, predominantly British oriented, like a lot of British, not that there's not American, but a lot of British material. Be interesting to note in the Maritime Baptist, and you've read these sources, all of them. And so it'd be interesting to note, if you could chart, the rise of American sources, but increasingly American culture, you start to have a Billy Graham in the 50s. He goes to Britain, and even Britons are now enamored with all things American, right? And so, but this is America's birth onto the global scene as well. Before this, America's really in isolation, self-imposed isolation with its, insular approach to foreign policy. But yeah, America's just catapulted onto the stage, and that changes a lot. But when you border America, it changes even more. I'm not sure I'm really nailing your question. So,
Okay. Shall we just, okay. She's granting. Yes, I know. I know Dr. Robbins is the boss, but she's very benevolent.
I'll stick to the question. I think it was Pike you
Yes.
quoted from a sermon, and you mentioned eschatology. So, kind of double-sided question. What texts were they preaching from? Or, in other words, what was the association between one form of nationalism and Christianity? And was there a change? He emphasized eschatology. Was there a change in the theology was there a change, or was it simply Canadian Baptists swapped one place they could get power for another, while failing to acknowledge their own part in that empire that did all the terrible things that they're now walking away from? So, a few questions in there, maybe.
Yeah, a lot of questions in there. So, one, the text would be in the source. I don't have it in front of me. So, it's not sort of a revelation-y kind of text. It's basically saying, don't worry, Christ is in charge. Communists won't win. So it's not like a pre, post, or amillennial kind of take. I'm sure it was, but I don't know. But the important point for Pike, that's a lot of P's, was it, don't worry, Jesus is coming back. Communism won't win. It's interesting. Now, this is related to eschatology, but it's maybe it's more providence, but maybe this will get to your point. Baptists read history like most Protestants did at the time, with their eye on God's providence. And so when they look at the 19th century, it's clear to them that God in his providence, so this is perhaps eschatological, post-millennial, things are getting better and better, onward and upward, which was pretty common in the 19th century because things appear to be getting better and better from a European perspective. But in God's providence, if you step into their world, it all makes sense. Everything makes sense. God has raised up Europeans to do what? Well, they've got good government, they'll export it around the world. They've got industry, they'll export that around the world. And lo and behold, what makes the cherry on top is they have Christianity, and they will export that around the world as well. And so that's kind of a flippant way to say it. But in God's providence, they're reading history. They're reading history, and it makes complete sense to them. So much so, you'll have British Israelists who will read history, and not only is Britain God's tool to spread Christianity and civilization around the globe, but actually the British people are from the 10 tribes of Israel, and the British monarchy is a continuation of those lost tribes, the monarchy of the lost tribes. And so Britain is pretty elevated when it comes to God and is working in human history. So I'm not sure if I'm getting to your comment about eschatology. Let me say this though. The notion of God's providence cuts both ways. If, like we look at it and say, well, they're just justifying, Britain's, expansion by saying, oh, God's behind it. But the very same people who talk about God's providence will also argue that because God has raised you up, the standard is higher for you. And so they will use the argument of God's providence also as a way of arguing against the sins of empire. Because if God has raised you up to do something, you better do it right. And so it's not that God is saying you need to dismantle your imperialism. It's just that you need to do imperialism right. And so, again, we can critique that theologically, but I'm trying to get us to step into their world and see it as they saw it. Obviously, there are some problematic aspects of what we're talking about, but I want us to first understand sort of how they would have seen the world. But I think in terms of eschatology, it's probably safe to say pretty optimistic, post-millennial, at least, if not stated overtly, almost just assumed that things are onward and upward. And certainly Christianity is spreading. Yeah, go ahead.
Pike was a thoroughgoing dispensationalist.
Oh, he was?
So he argues out of that kind of
Oh, okay.
the church and all that.
Right, okay. Would he think that things are getting worse or better, or how would he frame that?
Worse.
Well, worse here. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Okay, any others?
Didn't Anna have one?
Yes,
Oh,
I'm
okay,
just
you're gonna
giving
wait.
other people a chance. Yes. Dr. Robbins.
Thanks. This kind of plays off of Dr. Bob's question, which I think is related to Stuart's question as well. And it was cooking in my mind throughout. And so we're kind of talking around it a little bit. But I mean, did the Baptists in this period have a theology that fed this view? Or was it your sense that the history, the facts of what was unfolding around them influenced their theology? Or is the other way around? Have you found examples of a prophetic voice that kind of comes in and says, this, as you just mentioned, there are perils of empire, the sins of empire. Was there anyone saying that empire itself is sinful from a Baptist theological perspective? Because you know as well as I do, there are churches still here in the East as well as in Ontario that have the Union flag in the church, in a Baptist church, and pictures of the Queen. I mean, if we counted in Atlantic Canada, still the churches that have a picture of the Queen on the wall, it's astonishing, really, in the midst of all that. So I'm really interested in the kind of what you've encountered in the theology in that period, whether it was set by what was happening, or was there somewhere a voice that was kind of speaking into it and shaping the views?
I think first of all, the zeal for empire, like Brian Stanley, historian, good book, The Bible and the Flag. It's a great book on sort of British missionaries and empire. Talked about how if you wanted Baptists to support something, convince them that the spread of the gospel was at stake, and they would be ardently, raised into action. And Baptists in the 19th century are convinced, as are many other Protestants, are convinced that the spread of empires is a boon for missionary work. So we could, you could say, well, empires aren't a good thing, or empires aren't that. They'd say, but look, bam, like missionaries are spreading. And in a sense, this isn't completely fair, but in a sense, that's like an ultimate trump card. Mission work is being carried out. So there is bad. We'll speak prophetically against the bad. Now we know they had blinders on for what was bad, and so on and so forth. But if you're looking for a theology, in part, it's a theology of missions that sees that this empire is now going to open up the doors of missionary work. It's like when David Livingstone came out of Central Africa in the 1850s. What was the point of his discovery? For him, it was like, now we can go in and do what? Bring commerce. But why would we bring commerce? And why would we bring British rule? Put an end to slavery and spread the gospel. And so if you're in the 19th century, I'm not sure if I'm getting it directly, but follow up if I'm not. If you're anti-slavery, pro-mission work, you are supporting the spread of the British Empire if you're in British lands, because in your mind, that's what's happening. And that's what the British are, the war in South Africa, where I did my dissertation on the South African War. That was one of the main arguments. We're going in there to better the plight of Black South Africans. Now, did the plight of Black South Africans get bettered? No, not at all. But that was the rhetoric behind it, and people believe the rhetoric, right? And so that's a danger of believing rhetoric, right, and believing that kind of thing. But there's a lot going on. You talk about, and this is where Baptists, we're people of the book, we love the Bible, and we think that the Bible shapes our views on everything, right? That's what we want to believe. But the example of imperialism is a powerful example of how we are actually deeply, profoundly shaped by culture. And it is very hard sometimes to know what's gospel and what's culture. And this is like an object lesson in, boy, we better think hard, especially if people are being disenfranchised or hurt. Because maybe, just maybe, We have this wrong. But I mean, in this period of time, I listed all the things that, that were shaping the way of thinking about the world at the time, late 19th, early 20th century. The cult of manliness that emphasized the warrior aspect of being a man. You have ethnic, linguistic, and religious motivations for supporting empire. You have missions, anti-slavery, which was deeply embedded within the evangelical movement. If you're evangelical, you're anti-slavery. You have scientific advances, European scientific advances that just convince you that, oh yeah, my goodness, like look what Europeans are doing. You have social Darwinism, this follow the science in the late 19th century. Well, follow the science would lead you to rank races. That's the horrendous aspects of social Darwinism, but they're taking this on and it's shaping them. But then, and you asked for some people. I'll give you two examples. They're not theologians, but they're two people who I think profoundly shape how Baptists view empire. There is a reticence among some for empire because they're dissenters. Why would dissenters who are like anti-coercion support empire? But this is the same as dissenters in Britain, in Australia, New Zealand, Canada. So what was it? Well, a number of reasons why these dissenters, who intrinsically are opposed to any kind of coercion or state involvement in the church at all, what pushes them over the edge? A number of things. One is that the perception that they have Christian rulers. So I just, Melody's editing a volume from the recent International Conference of Baptist Studies, and I've submitted a chapter, and it's looking at the role of General Gordon, who's a famous British general, and Queen Victoria in the late 19th century, two people who were widely perceived to be godly leaders. One's a general, General Gordon, put to death in Khartoum in 1884, 85, I think, but he dies for the empire. But he's a Bible-reading, teetotaling, just godly, pious person in the eyes of Baptists. And Victoria's Queen Victoria, takes her faith seriously, godly woman and all that. And I argue in the chapter that those are important, iconic figures in ameliorating Baptist concerns about empire. Why? Because how could empire be so bad if Queen Victoria is leading? And how could empire be so bad if we have General Gordon leading? Like, these are godly people. How could it be bad? And so if you've got a list of like things that you're up, now those aren't theological arguments, but that's the weight of who your heroes are shapes how you perceive things. And those were heroes, and those are godly heroes. And so how can you say the empire's bad when the empress is a Christian and one of our famous leaders is a godly general? Now, in the midst of all that commentary, these people are not Pollyanna fools. They know that the sins of empire are rampant. And so they'll critique those. They'll see that as a corruption. But the ideals of empire and the British Empire are seen, to be something worth keeping. And my last thing, this is a long answer to your question, is that what's the alternative in that day and age? Baptists would argue. Let's be an imaginary Baptist, late 19th, early 20th century. Okay, empire bad. What are my options? It's the age of empires. Age of European empires, age of African empires, age of Asian empires, Ottoman Empire, Chinese Empire, Zulu Empire, European empires. It's just the age of empires. The only real vast region of republics would be South America. But other than that, you're in an empire. And so they would say, well, what's the best one? The one I'm in, the British Empire. So let's spread it. Right? And so, but then you get into the anti-Catholicism stuff. Like, you certainly don't want the French Empire expanding because, what are you going to get? You're going to get sort of an inferior version of Christianity, and you don't want, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of like today we're I think rightly so, opposed to empire, but it would be difficult in that day to come up with a different way of imagining the world. And that's why this is so important during, and actually a lot of it happens after the First World War. You have to buy my book. In fact, I know, but that's the.
They wouldn't have known anything else other than that they were shaped by their biblical theological.
I know, but I think this shows you just how powerful the imperialism of the air that they were breathing was. It's like Pierre Burton says, you're eating with your porridge in the morning, porridge, imperialism, and it's very hard. Now, dissenters historically have been able to dissent from very powerful cultural forces. But in this case, we look at it and go, now it starts to move, but what it seems like what happened was a lot of international events shaped, almost forced their change of how they viewed empire. So it's complicated. It's David Cannadine, British historian, said, I like this because it makes historians look good. So he said that it is the job of politicians and journalists to make everything appear simple. It is the job of historians to say everything is complicated, right? And I like that quote, and I'll finish with that because it makes historians look good. And I'm a historian, so. We have.
Oh, yes, and I want to give John an opportunity too. No? Okay.
Just to follow up, a trajectory after 56. Why does Canadian Baptist Mission Board or Canadian Baptist Ministries lead the way in terms of cooperative ministry and giving over the mission field to the people who live there and becoming their servants?
Why did they do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's
Yeah.
that trajectory.
Well, that's the trajectory, right? The trajectory frees them up to do just that. But that's happening among Anglicans, among United Church. It's happening among Presbyterians. There's a very real sense that the world has changed. We need to rethink how we do missions. And the first thing that means is we need to turn missions over to the people in the lands where missionaries are. And so that'll start, immediately. Actually, you have that commentary during the Second World War, if I remember correctly, but immediately after, especially with India in 46 and 47, a lot of commentary. What's going to happen to the church in India? What's going to happen? Well, we better turn it over to the Indians because it's their church. They better run it. But it's that trajectory, right? Which 50 years earlier, they never would have done. They wouldn't have said, well, let's just let the Indian church run itself. No, they would have said, in a paternalistic sense, we need to run it, right? So, yeah.
So you've traced an arc of very dramatic change tonight during the time period you're talking about. Could you skip ahead to today and talk a little bit, particularly with the death of the Queen and a lot of talk about the role of monarchy, the future of the Commonwealth system? I'm curious on your thoughts about where we might be headed.
Look at the time. Oh, look at the time. Sorry, we're out of time. So, yeah, I'll make it. I figured this question would come up, and I'm still trying to figure out a good answer for that, because one, we don't know what the future of the monarchy is, and the future of the Commonwealth is. Queen Elizabeth was such an iconic figure and dearly loved figure among many. Not everyone loved her, of course, but Charles is, Charles III, King Charles III. We'll have to see how that plays out. I think, in terms of how we as a nation, Canada, move forward, I think that there's a spectrum, and I'll say this. If this is one extreme, this is another extreme. The one extreme would be sort of this: let's just go back to the way it was. So I'm just going to create this ridiculous binary in one sense, but extremes. Let's go back to the way it was. Christian Canada, just this wonderful, Pollyanna world of, where the one we're really comfortable with. If you happen to be Anglo-Saxon and white, let's go back to that. The other is, let's just blow up everything. That's another extreme. Let's just blow it up and start all over again. I think wisdom is not found in either one of those extremes. I think nation building, as we reimagine what nation building is today, should be, now you asked me my opinion, this is what I think. I think the way forward is to be found in recognizing the good of the past. And I just don't mean empire, I just mean the good of the Canadian past, the lives that have been lived, the accomplishments of the nation, all those kinds of things, recognize them, but also acknowledge the sins of the past, the injustices of the past, and try and make recompense and to try and create some kind of reconciliation for those. And in some kind of wisdom of Solomon way to move forward without having to, go to that ridiculous extreme of let's just go back to the past or let's blow everything up. To figure out a way to take what is Canadian history, tradition, language, all of those things, good and bad, and figure out a way to move forward as a nation. That requires the wisdom of Solomon. That requires leaders, political leaders that are very astute, very wise, big-hearted, and capable and competent. But I think it also requires the churches to find a nation-building role. The nation-building churches of 100 years ago were building a certain kind of nation, the kind I described. But I think one of the problems for us as churches in a post-Christendom world is that we don't talk about nation building anymore because we're on the margins, right? We're not a Christian nation anymore. We're on the margins of power. So how do we proactively be nation builders when we're really supposed to be silent and just read our Bibles and do our little thing on Sunday morning? And so how do churches help in this process of nation building? Now, we can't pass laws, but we can put pressure on politicians to do things. But churches are good at reconciliation. Churches are good at building relationships. Churches are good at recognizing the truth, right? I mean, the truth of everyone's past in this room is not, pretty or clean. The truth of every denomination, of every nation, history is complicated and messy, but how can we as a nation bring together the good, recognize the good, but deal with deep, deep hurt and wrongs of the past in a way that somehow allows us to move forward as a nation? I don't have the solution to that, but I think avoiding those two extremes, and there are people on those extremes, we have to somehow, if you don't find a solution here in the middle, then people will gravitate to those extremes. And so we need to somehow figure out a way forward. And hopefully our leaders are up to the task, because that's not an easy task. Historic divisions, if not dealt with properly, can horribly go wrong. And so we need to be wise in how we move forward. And as Christians individually, maybe we can't change the laws of the nation, but I think individually we can act in ways that cement, now I'm talking the nation building process, cement bonds between people of different races and religions that creates a cohesive nation that transcends rancor and hatred and animosity and seeks real reconciliation and partnership as fellow Canadians.
I'm going to ask University Archivist Pat Townsend, also a member of the Administrative Committee, to offer our formal thanks to you.
Can you go up to the podium?
Hi, everybody. Well, please join me in thanking Gord for a most intriguing lecture this evening. I must say that I so wish that George Rawlyk could be with us tonight. He would have had so many questions, and he would have loved every minute of it. So please join me in thanking Gord.
So I have just two announcements before we gather ourselves together. First of all, there is an invitation for anyone in this area in person to attend the chapel service tomorrow morning here that begins at 11:15, I believe, or you may join that online as well. Our guest, Reverend Dr. Gordon Heath, will be preaching the sermon for that, so you're welcome to that. And I'm just to intrigue you, give you a little a little hint of next year. I mean, it's a whole year away, but next September, the 18th of September 2023, we'll be offering our Zeman Lecture, which will focus on the Anabaptist side of our work and interest. And that lecturer will be Dr. Nina Schroeder, who is a professor at the Free University of Amsterdam, and she'll be exploring the topic of Mennonites and the visual arts. So a very different sort of feel or flavor, but I think that should be good too. So in closing, I just want to thank you all for coming and joining and wish you a good evening.